You are watching part 16 of the full series of Java Spring Boot interview questions. These are the 5 questions we are going to discuss in this session. Describe the process of creating a RESTful API using Spring Boot. How does Spring Boot integrate with messaging systems such as RabbitMQ? Explain the concept of Spring Boot Data JPA and provide an example. How can you handle large file uploads in a Spring Boot application? What is the purpose of Spring Boot Actuator endpoints? First question. Describe the process of creating a RESTful API using Spring Boot. To create a RESTful API using Spring Boot, you can follow these steps. Step 1. Define your domain model and business logic. Step 2. Create a Spring MVC controller class and define handler methods annotated with @request mapping or other mapping annotations. Step 3. Implement the required CRUD operations within the handler methods using appropriate annotations like @getMapping, @postmapping, etc. Step 4. Customize the request and response handling with annotations such as @requestBody to map request payloads and @responseBody to define the response body. Step 5. Configure additional features like exception handling, input validation, and security if required. Step 6. Run the Spring Boot application and the API endpoints will be accessible based on the mappings defined in the controller. Second question. How does Spring Boot integrate with messaging systems such as RabbitMQ? Spring Boot provides integration with messaging systems like RabbitMQ through the Spring MQB project. To integrate RabbitMQ with a Spring Boot application, you can include the Spring Boot Starter AMP dependency and configure the necessary properties in the applications. Configuration file, application.properties or application.yml. You can use the RabbitTemplate class to send messages to RabbitMQ and consume messages using @RabbitListener annotations on appropriate methods. Third question. Explain the concept of Spring Boot Data JPA and provide an example. Spring Boot Data JPA is a subproject of Spring Data that provides enhanced support for JPA, Java Persistence API-based repositories in Spring Boot applications. It simplifies the implementation of the data access layer by automatically generating the boilerplate code for common database operations. For example, by defining a JPA entity class and extending JPA repository, you can get CRUD operations for that entity without writing any additional code. You can also define custom queries using method name conventions or @query annotations. Next question. How can you handle large file uploads in a Spring Boot application? To handle large file uploads in a Spring Boot application, you can configure the maximum file size limit in the application's properties file. By setting the spring.servlet.multipart.max file size and spring.servlet.multipart.max request size properties to appropriate values. Additionally, you can use the multipart file parameter in the controller method to receive the uploaded file and process it as needed. Next question. What is the purpose of Spring Boot Actuator endpoints? Spring Boot Actuator endpoints provide insights into the internals of a Spring Boot application such as health status, metrics, environment information, and more. These endpoints expose management and monitoring capabilities over HTTP or other protocols, allowing you to monitor and manage the application in production. Actuator endpoints can be customized and secured based on the specific requirements of the application. Hope you have learned something and feel confident to answer the questions we discussed so far. Here is the list of questions that will be discussed in the next session. Please check out our playlist for more questions and subscribe our channel for updates and notifications. Good luck for your upcoming interviews.